Hello all, and welcome back to our 5-minute Bible study series. We are talking about Numbers chapter 24 today. Exciting day because we are mostly going to finish up the story of Balaam and Balak. They're talked about a little bit more in the rest of the Bible, but we'll talk about that in our application section. Our main characters for this chapter, Balak, he is the king of the Moabites, and Balaam, he was the son of Beor. He was from Mesopotamia, so he wasn't an Israelite. He was a practitioner of divination. And if you want to know more about Balaam, I actually created a handout specifically on him that you can get on the website. And it's called Who Was Balaam in the Bible? So that'll give you a nice comprehensive picture of his life. Our when and our where really haven't changed very much from the last couple chapters. These events occurred at the tail end of the Israelites' 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, right before they entered Canaan. This would be approximately 1450 BC. And then on over to our map, the Israelite camp is still around the area of Pisgah, Mount Pisgah. They were camped at the border of the Amorites and the Moabites, and this is why Balak was so concerned, because he was the king of Moab and the Israelites were right on the border of his land. As we move on over into our outline, I would again encourage you to read chapter 22 and chapter 23, because if you don't know chapter 23, it's going to be pretty hard to understand what's going on in this chapter. So verses 1 through 13 is our first section, Balaam's third discourse continued. So in chapter 23, Balak tried to get Balaam to curse Israel 2 times. But you remember what happened? God gave Balaam a blessing for Israel rather than a curse. Chapter 24 opens in the middle of Balak's third attempt to get Balaam to curse Israel. So Balak once again built 7 altars, he sacrificed 7 bulls and 7 rams on these altars, and when that was complete, the Spirit of God came on Balaam and he began his third discourse. And what do you think happened? For a third consecutive time, he blessed the Israelites. He said that the kingdom of Israel would be exalted because God was on their side. They would crush and defeat all of their enemies, and anyone who blessed Israel was going to be blessed by God. Now, the king of Moab, Balak, he was naturally furious. He had killed 21 bulls, built 21 altars, killed 21 rams, and he still couldn't get the curse on Israel that he wanted this whole time. Once again, though, Balaam just reminded him that he wasn't allowed to speak anything that God didn't give him to speak, and God had given him only blessings. The chapter concludes in verses 14 through 25, talking about Balaam's final prophetic discourse. So God gave Balaam one more thing to say before he parted ways with King Balak, and it had to do with the fate of the Israelites and the fate of Balak's nation, the Moabites. Balaam prophesied that a star and a scepter would rise out of Israel and they would crush the Moabites. He went on to announce future judgment on several of the surrounding peoples and nations, including the sons of Sheth, the Edomites, the Amalekites, the Kenites, and the people of Eber. And after finishing his message from God, Balak and Balaam parted ways, at least for the time being. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in our application section. So let's do that now. In our application section, I've pulled a section of text from my handout, Who Was Balaam in the Bible, to help you to understand the future of his life a little bit better and to draw an application from that. The application for today is that God can use men with corrupt hearts to complete his will. So unfortunately, although we'd love to think that Balaam was a guy who was just, this man of faithfulness and he respected God's words, that wasn't necessarily the legacy that he was going to leave. So let me read this section. This text can leave the reader with the impression that Balaam was a faithful man of God, but Balaam didn't retain that reputation. In 2 Peter chapter 2:15, the apostle Peter tells us that Balaam loved, quote, gain from wrongdoing. And Revelation chapter 2, verse 14, that's the last book of the Bible, tells us Balaam taught Balak to put a stumbling block in front of the Israelites. It appears that Balaam found another way to help King Balak, even though God had forbid him to curse Israel. In Numbers chapter 31, a few chapters after this, Moses said that Balaam advised Balak to get the Midianite women to seduce the Israelites into idolatry and worship of false gods. We'll read about that actually in the next chapter, Numbers 25. God would go on to punish both Israel, the people of Midian, and Balak for this immorality. So Balaam turned out to not be a great guy. Seems like after he, had these interactions, these 3 interactions with King Balak, he's like, okay, well, God won't allow me to curse these people, but maybe I can give Balak some advice where, he could thwart Israel in another way. And evidently, he got a little kickback from that. So Balaam played a role in God's larger story, as did other wicked men, like Pharaoh, who we already talked about, like Judas Iscariot, the guy who betrayed Jesus. And what we need to understand is that these men have a role, and that wicked men do not thwart God's plans. God's plans are still going to work out, and he's still going to bless his people, even though these evil men are trying to oppose him. What we need to know is that we really ought to ally ourselves with God and serve him willingly. But if we refuse to do that, then he can still use us in his story for his glory.